Hi, this is Arvid from Econ Explains, and today we will talk about how auditing can reduce corruption in emerging economies. And we will discuss a paper by Ben Olken, a professor at MIT. And in this paper, he investigates corruption in road village construction projects in Indonesia. And at the time of the paper, as part of a nationwide infrastructure initiative, 600 villages are tasked to build their own roads. But they must report their costs to the government to get reimbursed. And here is where the corruption comes in. Because the paper estimates that 25 to 30% of costs never were actually made. That means that if the village charged the government 100 rupees, they took about 25 rupees for themselves because those costs were not actually made. So to tackle this corruption, the paper sets out to explore two forms of monitoring to counter this abuse: the classical approach and grassroots intervention. The first is classical monitoring. Certain villages are notified that they will be audited by the central government. And so the probability of being audited goes up from 4% to 100%. So you would expect an impact in this category. Second, the other form of monitoring is grassroots monitoring, whereby people from the village are asked to keep an eye on the project. And the paper investigates two types of this monitoring. First, one where accountability meetings are held, where project officials have to account for every penny spent. And in the other form, anonymous comment forms are distributed to the people from the village, encouraging them to share information about the project. But wait, how do you measure corruption? Well, the author involved an independent team of engineers and surveyors to analyze the construction after its completion. They assessed the road quality, scrutinized the materials used, and even considered local supplier prices. And based on this information, they can estimate how much the project actually should have cost instead of what was reported. So let's now look at the results of the monitoring interventions. On this graph, you can see the percentage missing costs on the y-axis. And this is the difference between reported costs by the village and the estimated costs by the independent team. On the horizontal axis, we first have the baseline result. In this case, audits happened only rarely. Then there are the results following the classical audits, where the villages knew they were going to get an audit. Now, in the baseline case, missing costs are 29.6% of overall expenditures. That means that for every 100 rupees reported, about 30 were not actually made in costs and likely stolen. In addition, you can see the breakdown between missing material and missing labor costs. Now, knowing that villages were going to get audited reduced overall missing costs, which is corruption, from 29.6% to 21.1%, and that is an 8 percentage point reduction. So this was a success. But even with a 100% probability of getting an audit, 20% of costs still mysteriously go missing. So why is that? Well, even though auditors uncover violations in a staggering 90% of cases, there was often not enough concrete evidence to start prosecution. And one idea the paper puts forward to basically tackle corruption in this case is that if the probability of being caught is low, you could increase the penalties in order to discourage future corruption. Now, let's switch gears to grassroots monitoring. Let's look at the same graph, but now for the grassroots experiment. Surprisingly, overall corruption does not go down. Instead, it even slightly goes up. On the other hand, missing labor costs do go down. But what happens is that the misreporting now switches from labor costs to the missing material costs. And the paper argues that people in the village can more easily monitor wages and labor, but they have a hard time evaluating material costs. The paper also looked at the anonymous comment forms. And this treatment did reduce corruption, but only if the forms were distributed exclusively via schools and not via the government officials. And the idea is that the local government officials might basically inhibit people getting the form or using it. So in a nutshell, grassroots monitoring shines when tackling corruption in labor-intensive services, for example, medical services, because it's easy for people to monitor it. We also have to be careful that local elites cannot stifle grassroots efforts. Classical audits, on the other hand, emerge as a useful tool to combat corruption. And if detection proves challenging or it's hard to prosecute, you can also drive up penalties to discourage that corruption. Also, if you're interested in more ways to reduce corruption, check out my video on empowering citizens to stand up to corruption by informing them of their rights in another experiment in Indonesia.